right? Come on, finish off your sandwich, put your cup of tea down. Soup, done. Good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you had a good lunch. Welcome to today's National EV Week session that I'm hosting, session 2, Unplugging from the Grid, Renewables, Storage, and Your Business's Net Zero Power Strategy, kindly sponsored by UrbanChain, more of which in a moment. I'm John Curtis of the EV Cafe, your host for today and poser of your questions later in the session. You'll see at the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, there's a question mark. If you have a question that you want to pose to our esteemed guests, then hit that little button, type in your question, and I'll try and get to it at the end of this session. Now then, if you're a fleet manager, depot manager, you probably feel a little bit of frustration. You're constantly battling with price spikes, whether you're using petrol, diesel, or electricity. And when you have an electric fleet and you want to expand that fleet, the biggest roadblock can be the grid itself. And the conversation around fleet decarbonisation usually focuses on consuming energy, i.e. charging vehicles. But today, we're going to shift that focus to creating and controlling your own power, putting you squarely in the driving seat. We're offering you energy independence, if you like, as the ultimate solution to bypass grid constraints and cost volatility. This is a session for anyone who's tired of waiting for the grid and ready to take control of their power and their balance sheet. And to guide us through this complex but critical topic, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 true industry giants. First up, we've got Graeme Cooper from AECOM. Graeme brings deep infrastructure and planning expertise gained at, amongst other places, National Grid. He's got the most unbelievable 600-year-old home, which is completely sustainable, utterly brilliant. We'll hear more about that in a minute. And he's the person who understands how strategically you can integrate solutions into complex commercial operations. Graeme, welcome to you. Second up, we've got our sponsor. We've got Parry from UrbanChain. Charlie's at the cutting edge of energy technology, helping businesses move beyond the traditional supplier and user model into a future of peer-to-peer energy trading. Charlie, great to have you here. Looking forward to that. And finally, we've got the man who's got the biggest one in the UK. Oh, yes. It's John Fairlie of AW Energy, who has personally been responsible for the introduction of about 70% of all the wind turbines you see in the UK in some way, shape or form. And his latest achievement, this big one, is the largest onshore wind turbine in the UK in Leighton Buzzard. And he's also got some really fabulous charging facilities for cars, vans and trucks. And over the next hour, we'll break down this whole area of renewables, generation, storage, and use into 3 areas: operational challenges, the financial case, and the smart energy future. Right, let's get dived in because it's 3 minutes past 2, and we're targeting fleet managers. Let's not forget this, who are facing real immediate pain. Graeme, I'm going to start with you, with Charlie and John. If you're in back up there for a second, you can jump in after. What's the single biggest operational headache with the current energy market, Graeme? Is it price volatility? Is it grid connection and capacity? What's causing a problem for fleets and depot managers right now?
You're right on both those counts, right? So there is volatility, right? So yeah, you're winning. But no, normally the thing that hits people head on, particularly as fleet managers, is they say, I want a fleet of vehicles. They're going to need this many chargers. Where do I plug it in? The next awkward question usually ends up with them saying, yes, it's going to be 14 million quid and you're going to have to wait 5 years. Wrong answer, right? But let's just understand why. Okay, so over the next 20 years, we're going to double the amount of electricity we consume as a country, right? We're going to have 4 times the amount of clean generation than we do today as a country, and we're going to need twice the grid. So the grid is on catch-up, okay, because it has moved slowly in very mature markets. We now have the energy transition, so it's trying to move fast. Grid doesn't move fast. This is big strategic infrastructure. So there is a lag. But then what that then drives you to is that democratization of energy. So you mentioned it in your sort of intro. One of the things that I think, one of the sort of the examples I would use is Do you send your fleet to the local petrol station, or do you have a Bowser on site? Right. So that is the mindset. So what can you do yourself to control your destiny? What can you do to control your destiny to buy time for the grid to catch up? But also, the cheapest and cleanest energy is the energy you don't use or the energy that you use yourself. So I think there's a combination of things. There's the physical infrastructure, the capacity, and then it's a case of the what and the how. And you've got some other experts on the screen who play different roles in each of those places. But I would argue that you cannot just assume that you can just plug a charger in, right? Okay, we're on the energy transition, and that takes some doing. But it's a great opportunity, to, as you say, to democratize energy and to take a role in your own role in that participation. Who would have thought you can be your own power station, your own energy market, participate, and then supply your own fleet? So it needs whole systems thinking. Most people just kind of go, I buy the vehicles, I buy a charger, and away we go. It just needs a little bit more thinking than that.
It does a lot more thinking, because traditionally we've had this centrally generated, if you like, energy, which goes into a grid, is distributed nationally at scale to everybody. And we've taken that very much for granted. And now what the transition to electric vehicles is doing is exposing where the gaps are. And that takes innovative thinking, different ways of looking at how you generate energy locally for local use and then distribute more widely. And Charlie, I'm going to come to you about the distribution piece in just a second. But John, at scale, local generation of energy is something you have done for quite a while. Tell us about it.
Yes, we are renewable energy developers. So we develop wind and solar projects. And we started thinking really about what we can do to address some of the issues that we have now that, for example, we're operating renewable energy without a feed-in tariff, without a renewables obligation. What can we do to actually generate power on a wholesale basis, but sell it as close as we can to the source? And that's where we came up with the idea of the EV charging station that we have at Checkley Wood, which is 14 ultra rapid chargers that we've direct wired to a large scale 4.1 megawatt turbine. Now it's a bit of an extreme project in certain respects, because that is a big turbine, and you'd require quite a large utilization to dispense. It's about 10.5 million kilowatt hours per annum. But that was done really as from our perspective, a demonstration as to what you can do in terms of wiring directly renewables to a consumer. And when you start looking at how that can be sized to a smaller scale, so where you're talking to fleet managers who maybe have room for solar or room for a smaller amount of wind coupled with batteries, as a concept, it's the same. It's just at a very different scale.
And Charlie, that's the important part, isn't it? That it's easy in some regards to do it big, to go big, to make a massive investment in huge bits of infrastructure and feed it into the grid. But actually, the secret to plugging these gaps is very much a more local approach, and then networking distribution so that you can take it to new customers, right?
Yeah, completely. And the way that we built UrbanChain and we look, it's a technology platform that matches on a half-hourly basis. So what that means, when John's describing a direct wire and a private wire, that's excellent for some scenarios, but we want to replicate that virtually. So it's an idea of many generators powering many consumers. In the EV transition, public charge points, their main challenge is price and affordability. What we see is the fastest way of bringing that down is not through volume, but it's through when you're charging. So matching to abundance of renewables, be that overnight, be that through batteries, be that through responding to flexible signals. One of the clean drivers in there are fleets. They have users of cars that can respond to those. They've got predictable, flexible offtake. What it means is a lower cost on the public networks, which is passed through for drivers, it's passed through an increased utilization, it's passed through in faster ROI for investors. And then when we look at a depot level, it's that combination of self-generation, flexibility responding to signals and using the right technology type. So if that's an abundance of onshore wind in Scotland, if that's solar in the south of England, actually, how do we create these networks of local generation? And to Graeme's point, that starts to take some stress off the transmission networks, which means less physical infrastructure. We can get there over time.
Yeah, and of course, the electric vehicle becomes part of that ecosystem because it's one of the ways in which you can store that renewable energy that's created wherever it is. Graeme, we've long thought about electric vehicles as a storage medium or media, but we've also got battery electric storage systems which can be put into local generation facilities. How is that changing the relationship between the centralised energy provider and business?
So look, let's just be really clear. This is not a case of do big grid or do distributed energy. The answer is both. Okay, so this is it's not an either or, it's an and. That's the first important step. The next important step is, I guess, wow, how do I best sort of describe this? So what the energy system values is flexibility. It doesn't value batteries. Batteries are just a form of flexibility. So before we even get to batteries, just think about time of use tariff, right? Use more power when the power is plentiful, cheap, and the grid is less stressed. Use less when it's expensive and dirty. You know, I mean, this is not a new invention, right? We had it, I think some of us will remember Economy 7 late night storage heaters, right? Because we needed something to sort of suck up the spare nuclear energy overnight. So this is not a new phenomenon. But what has changed is we now have lots of variable generation on the grid, so wind and solar. But also what we've got is lots of movable load. And I don't mean movable as far as on four wheels. I mean movable as to when can it charge. So what you've got is a situation now, which is you've got variable generation, you've got variable demand, and you get the best of both by flexing both. So when it's plentiful, you use it, then you're not paying for it to stop. But also you have the added benefit of avoided use of the grid. So the way the grid has always been paid for is you build, they call it to peak plus headroom. So you design the grid for the 5 hours, the 5 most stressful hours of the year, right? Normally happens in the winter on a pretty miserable time, plus about 20% headroom. That's our factor of safety. So that's how our energy system's built. But what that means is for 364 and most of a day a year, the system is inefficiently utilized. So we're now moving into a way where we're trying to sweat grid assets, so put more across the existing wires without having to build as much. And it still means you have to build, but you're not building to that peak plus headroom. You're building, you know, smartly, right? But what that does enable you to do then is to do a bunch of things. So firstly, there's an avoided cost. The cost of the grid falls on everybody's bill. It's about 25, National Grid is about £25 a year on everybody's bill, roughly, right? For one of the world's most reliable power systems. And I no longer work for National Grid, but I'm still a fan. But what you've got is now the ability to flex time, which takes pressure off the grid. Flex tariff takes pressure off the grid. And batteries are a great way of providing that storage. But please don't think that batteries are the only answer. If you are a fleet manager and you are getting stressed about that, I have to go and ask for the big capital spend to buy a battery, wait a minute. What is the least capital expensive cost? So smart charging, program charging, time of use tariff, you know, do smart, literally, UrbanChain's a great business. You know, I've worked for them previously. You know, what a great way of buying energy in the cheapest possible way, matching, you know, clean generation to demand. So there is a real opportunity there. So don't just assume that you can jump into a battery. Do the least cost thing first, which is recognize that grids and energy systems value flexibility, and that can turn up in other ways than just batteries.
Absolutely. And flexibility, of course, is something which, John, you have at Checkley Wood, in that you do just generate energy. It's a clear line of sight between your generation, your storage of the battery, and then the use by trucks, cars, vans. So there's a very, very straight line. Do you see a time when there'll be more Checkley Woods, and that using systems such as UrbanChain will enable you to distribute in a more efficient and intelligent way?
Potentially, and certainly we have consent for another one, and we're waiting to build that. The issue that we have on that is grid connections, and when you're looking at something at scale where you're exporting, the export rules are very, very different to the import rules. We're going through something called connections reform at the moment, which is looking to reorder the grid queue and actually prioritize shovel-ready projects before a lot of speculative schemes that are on the network. That process is very, very new to the system operator and very new to all the DNOs, and it's taking time to shuffle all of those projects around in the right order, but also to understand what's going on at each grid supply point to work out whether they can accept those projects in that particular order. So there's a lot going on the export, which makes it very difficult when you're looking at large-scale renewables that can export. What we are hearing is that the speculation market, if you like, has now been moving on to import, and lots of import capacity has been bagsied essentially by projects that aren't necessarily going ahead. So we expect there's going to be a similar sort of process going on at some point on the import as well as the export. But as a way to ensure that you're essentially cutting out the middleman, if you like, generating on site and consuming on site, consuming your own stuff is certainly we're finding to be a very good way of sharing the benefit of renewable energy as well, which unfortunately it's you think you solve one problem and you end up with another hurdle somewhere else. But where Graeme mentioned and Charlie mentioned going first for the simple options, going first at where's the time on the system where you can charge because the power's available and maybe more cheaply. That's the way to do it. And there's a decision tree going from there all the way up to what you think your maximum requirement would be.
I really thank you for that answer, John. And Graeme, great to put in. Please ask us the hard questions. Use the question button at the bottom right-hand corner, that little question mark, because we're going to really test these guys later. Charlie, I'm wondering what insights you have bringing software to bear to better use the systems that we have. You must have learned some stuff about how local generation, at scale generation operates, and how you can find the best use of the energy that we have. What have you learned?
Headline, shift it. It's about a 20% price saving is probably the very simplistic piece there, because charging behavior on public charge point operators is unpredictable. It's very difficult to shift behavior. If you need to charge and you're traveling, you need to charge. So there's always going to be an element of daytime peak. That's expensive. That's hard. If you can shift more of that outside of those peak morning hours and evening hours when energy is expensive, we've seen about a 20% difference. So that's before you even get to anything remotely intelligent around batteries, fleet optimization, flexibility. So the headline, can you use it when there's more available? So that's what we're starting to try and work with charge point operators and fleets, with some of the fleet providers, the fuel cards and the EV charge point management systems. We just want to be an energy layer into that. Most people don't care about energy. It's just a big P&L line item for them now, and increasingly so around electrification. What's really going to drive that is your fleet charging in the morning when you need to use it? Is there fleet availability on my routes? We want to plug into those softwares, those collaborations to mean, well, let's do it at a point that gives you either a more affordable cost, avoids volatility, more importantly, and then also you've got that traceability. So when you start to think about, I've got to do scope 2 reporting, carbon reporting, all of that is there as a direct byproduct from it. So there's kind of steps to this. And I think there'll be a transition that we take people on from charge differently before we get into optimization roles.
John, can I dive in?
Yes,
can I dive in for a second? There's something Charlie said that I think is actually, a lot of people miss a point here. They kind of go, well, I don't need to worry about energy till my fleet manager says worry about energy. No. Stop right there. In almost every business, one of your probably top 4 biggest costs is energy, right? So you spend a lot of time on strategy and marketing and sales and investments. The one thing is because energy's been done to us for so long, it's just a bill that turns up. It's like tax. We just write a check and don't think about it. So the one thing I'd say is, use the thinking about your decarbonizing your fleet as the catalyst to have an energy strategy for your whole business. Think about it holistically. This is a system of systems that can be managed and optimized. Now, imagine if you went to your CFO and said, "I can take 20% off your one of your top 4 biggest costs." That CFO is going to want to buy you chocolates and flowers, because where else are you going to get that sort of savings? So what I would say is use that discussion as a fleet manager around, my fleet is now changing its fuel type, to change your relationship with energy. Make sure energy is now actually one of those strategic things that the leadership team think about. It's part of your investment strategy. It's part of your management strategy. It's part of your financial strategy. Use it as that catalyst, because it's only when you look at the whole do you realize what critical parts can move and shift in time to have realized that 20% saving. And that's why I think we sometimes put the blinkers on and think the only thing is changing is the things on 4 wheels with a big battery. No, everything's changing, right? And so you need to have the context of that, in the context of everything else changing. So sorry to jump in, but I think it's an important one.
It is important. It's the whole system thinking, is what you're saying, that we can no longer think about any of these things in isolation. And energy is actually right at the very start. Where do I get that power from? And how can I better use what we've already got, and then potentially generate our own, store it locally, and then use it for our own uses before then potentially selling it back to the fleet. There's a whole
But even then, there's a thing that's sort of missing here, is if you had a fuel bowser for your fleet, you can't really make money from your fuel bowser. You just put fuel in it and take it off when you want. Hang on, if you've got a battery or you've got self-generation, you can spill back to the grid and get paid for it, right? When you're generating more than you need. But also the grid values flexibility. So your battery can provide grid services. So without getting too geeky, frequency response and voltage control, keeping the lights from flickering, keeping them stable. The grid pays for those services. If you've got a battery, it can squirt a little bit of power on or take a little bit of power off and actually help correct that. So you've now got a revenue stream where you thought you just had a cost. That changes the fundamental business model.
Yes,
and that's
absolutely.
where it's so important to look at it as a whole. And when you're looking at energy as a whole, you can then helps inform that investment decision when you're looking at an amount of capex, because you can see how much you will likely spill into the grid, how much you will likely make, how much services you can provide. And it's really interesting when you talk about fuel bowsers, because when you think about it, you only really notice a lack of energy when it's gone. You plug into something most of the time, but remember the times when we used to have fuel problems, and you turn up to the petrol pump and there'd be a queue down the A5 or whatever, waiting to fill up the tanks, and you only realize when it's gone and when there's a problem. And the other thing about this sort of whole energy approach is that it also increases your energy security as well, so it gives you more certainty over operation.
And energy security, as far as you're concerned, John, relates to having energy when you need it and generated here locally. How do you define energy security?
It's wherever you get your energy from, whether it be from a petrol pump or from the grid or whatever. It's the reliability. It's being there when you need it, and with electricity, obviously 24/7. And the one thing I would say about it is with the grid, National Grid plan a long way ahead. They know they have their winter outlooks, their summer outlooks. They know that they're running a secure grid. It's a matter of national security to run a secure grid. So as we're transitioning from a system where we're getting our energy from lots of different places into a system that is more around the electrification of everything we do, we're plugging into a more reliable system with more security behind us.
I'm going to pick up a comment from P. Aspen. Too much talk about the grid. I thought this was about interim off-grid solutions, which will help the grid in the longer term, provide solutions now, not in 10 years. And I guess what I've been trying to do is to explore our reliance on the grid, because that's what we've always known, and to open up minds to other options which take us into microgrids, to local generation, to local storage. So apologies, have I missed the point there? Because I think we are dealing with very much off-grid solutions. Graeme?
So one thing I think is often missed, particularly around off-grid, is most energy systems need power to run, right? Right. So when people say, "Oh, is this about entirely off-grid?" Entirely off-grid is really difficult because the energy density of vehicles needs a huge array of panels in the sun. So the comment was about California and Tesla. Yes, they've got acres and acres and acres and acres of solar, and then a huge, very expensive battery, and they can be properly off-grid, right? The cold reality is in the UK, we're not blessed with all of that sun and all of that acreage. So what I would say is a lot of this discussion is about sweating the limited grid capacity you have today. So if you're just running a small workshop and you're running some welders and some computers and some lighting, and then you want to add a fleet vehicle, it might be one demand too much. So it's not a case of you can't, you just need to be smart. Can you self-generate to mitigate the limitation of the grid? Can you put a battery storage on so that you can charge it, off peak and charge your truck when at peak? So I guess it's not as binary as off grid, on grid. I think our discussion is everything in between. It's not as binary as one or the other. I hope that answers your question, P. Aspen, but feel free to ask more difficult questions.
Charlie.
I was going to say to that, one of the things that we're working on is, yes, you've got, your own behind the meter solutions. So solar on the roof of a site, a battery on there. We want to enable sharing of that. So if you can put solar on a different site and export it, you can share that to your sites that are on the same location, a different location. You create these virtual private markets. So you're not fully off grid, but you're going, well, I'm replicating what I would be using myself. Anything excess that is not currently being used, someone else can have the benefit of that, which kind of suits that charge at the time that it's available.
I'm fascinated by this concept of space and that we need space to be able to generate our own renewables off grid. I've seen a number of brilliant sites, very, very restricted. One of them off the top of my head is in Milton Keynes at Dawson Group, where they've used solar canopies, battery storage, to be able to generate energy for vans, electric vans. And it's utterly brilliant in how they are able to use a city centre location on an industrial estate and a relatively small space to generate the maximum amount of energy for their own use. It is possible, and I think one of the things which does frustrate me is big is always better. Well, big isn't always possible, but everybody can make a contribution. Doesn't matter whether you're in a city, a town, a village, whatever it is, you can support your own energy needs. How do we move to that sort of thinking, John? You've gone big and you've said, well, there you go, there's a whopping great turbine. How do we get planners and how do we get local authorities to understand that putting solar panels on a roof in an industrial location is actually a good thing to do on our public buildings, and that then we can use the expertise that Charlie brings to bear to distribute that and use it effectively?
We are seeing a planning system that is increasingly more supportive of renewables. It has had its peaks and troughs. We've just come out in the wind side. We've just come out of a very, very deep trough. And we're starting now to see a much more positive system, a much more positive approach from planners, because what we are also seeing as well as that is a general public who want to see more renewable energy. And whenever we poll around any of our sites, if it's wind, for example, our latest one, we polled as far as 500 meters from the site, the closest residents, we were getting 85% in favour of having another site nearby. So we are seeing very, very positive feedback, and really, I think where we're looking at panels, for example, in an industrial location, I can't see there being any problem now in planning terms whatsoever in going ahead with something like that. And I'd say it's a bit like what Graeme said, though. It's all about looking at to answer that off-grid question, it's about looking at what is your load, what does adding the charger do to that, and actually you don't have to go too supersized. What works, and that it's really softening your impact on the grid more than anything else, in order to get your project away.
Now we've got three of the biggest brains that I have ever had the fortune to have on a webinar, and I want to tap into your experience. What's the single biggest hidden cost within renewable energy projects that businesses consistently forget to budget for? Start with Graeme.
Oh, that's a really good one. I guess the one thing I've seen most recently is volatility and energy cost, right? You can do long-term planning and so volatility and energy cost. And that's one of those things that I would say is a neat link to Charlie, because one of the things by having a good supply agreement where you are trying to mitigate some of that, you know, as a user, it's very difficult for you to second guess what the generations market's doing, what wind and solar are doing. Right? How do you play it? Whoa. Outsource that volatility to someone who's managing that on a daily, minutely, and hourly sort of perspective. Have a good PPA to help mitigate that cost. Do not assume, and then there's a slightly secondary one, is it's often the capex. People kind of go, well, a charge is going to be, you know, if it's a small one, it's a few £100. If it's a big DC charger, it's, you know, thousands, right? They assume that's the cost. There's a lot behind that between there and the grid, which costs you a ton of money. But it also means that you don't necessarily have to have, a lot of people think they just have to write the big check. There are ways in which you can mitigate those costs. Someone else can provide that capex. You can have charging as a service, right? So what I would say is it's about two things: business model innovation. You don't necessarily have to do the capex yourself and get that scary cost, and mitigate the risk of price volatility by having a great PPA. PPA, power purchase agreement, the supply agreement, right?
Yeah. John, what do you think?
I would probably add to that, if as part of any project you're looking to increase your import capacity, looking very, very carefully at the standing charges that are associated with that, because they are charged on a per kVA basis, and that could be something that you haven't accounted for. But if you get your balance right between your own on-site generation and your import, you may not need to increase your import to get your charger in. So it's looking at that, the bill as a whole as well. So looking at those standing charges to one side, very important.
Thank you, John. Charlie, biggest hidden costs that people forget?
Probably two that we see on our side, outside of headline price and what the shape of your consumption looks like. Standing charges, as John says, so grid capacity has a huge bearing on what that standing charge is. That is a fixed fee per day. So it's not one of those that's flexible and comes down. The more you consume, the less the impact. It is fixed. Often in the early stage of people rolling out capex, that's quite punitive, particularly if they're putting in DC fast charges or big grid connections, because they're expecting a lot of throughput. The second one is where in the country they're going, as we'll see different non-commodity prices depending on what distribution network they're in. So one of the things we've been working with some operators and fleets is, are there cheaper places in the country to put those charges first that still work for them? That means they get a faster payback on the capex and fill into the other areas later. So they're two commodity related pieces that don't necessarily come up until you get to the weeds of your energy contract discussion.
That's helpful. Now, brilliant point from Neil Stott. As a rooftop solar installer, we find that most clients struggle to see a commercial case for battery storage today. Given this, what are your thoughts on allowing DNOs to own or operate the storage and do it locally to enable more on-site renewable generation with surplus export managed and returned to local users when needed? Do the energy companies need to be part of that storage solution?
No. This is an important one. This is a really important one. So one of the things that happened across Europe many years ago is the European third package unbundling. If you are a generator, you cannot be the owner of a network. If you are the owner of a network, you cannot be the retailer of energy. We've separated out the roles so that they're not blurring the lines as to who's making money and price gouging and who's not, right? So the first thing is under UK legislation for energy, the utilities cannot own battery storage. So it's not a case of want or not want. They're not allowed to, right? Yeah. However, what they can do is buy services. So I know Neil. Hi, Neil. Good to see you. They can buy services. But what we've seen in that marketplace is lots of people flooding the market with solar. So we see big stuff, transmission grade solar. We see sort of middle market, sort of pretty big, but in the distribution system, and we see home systems. So what you're seeing right now is, to some extent, battery is cannibalizing batteries, right? They're all chasing the limited pot of flexibility money, which is an important revenue stream. But look forward to the amount of clean renewables and variable stuff that's coming onto the grid in the coming handful of years. We're going to need more flexibility everywhere. It will be priced everywhere. So what you've got is, at the moment, falling battery prices, good, but you've also got falling demand for those services, not so good. So it's a case of chicken, egg, egg, chicken, and I think some of that market will come back. The one thing I would say is, there are businesses out there doing trading, flexibility trading, your virtual power plant trading. Work with somebody who's not thinking about your battery, they're thinking about yours and 700 other batteries that they can use to flex the grid at a higher commercial scale. So again, this is about business model innovation. Don't necessarily expect the person who owns the battery to be the person who controls the battery. Sorry, long answer to a short question, but it's important. They can't own storage.
It isn't. And Charlie, I think this is where you come in, isn't it? It's this peer-to-peer and linking things up so that you make the very best use of what's available. Can you explain in layman's terms how peer-to-peer works?
Very simply, it's sharing. It's enabling your traditional relationship with energy is very linear. It is a supplier that buys power from a generator and it sells it down to a consumer in a very straight line, all the way down. There's risk premiums applied, hedging, shaping costs. So what the end consumer pays, more expensive. What we're doing is enabling a direct relationship on a many-to-many basis. So we forecast consumption shapes, generation. And what that means is that for every half hour in a day, you'll be matched with a generator. And that means if you're a consumer of power, and that means it could be a solar farm at midday, it could be a battery at 12:30, it could be anaerobic digestion later on in the evening, that you're being matched with these multiple sources rather than buying it together. In the context of this, it's enabling to take excess solar from buildings and share that to someone when they're consuming in the middle of the day. It's taking battery export in an evening when it otherwise would be very expensive. And let's say a site doesn't need that power, it can share it directly with them. The battery example there, I think, is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's all flexibility. So it can respond to price signals. Traditionally, batteries have made their money, as Graeme says, in flex markets. But can you use them as a pure exporting asset and a pure consuming asset? So really simply, it consumes power at a time of day that it's cheaper when there's more renewables on the grid. And can it sell it? So instead of into a flexibility market before, can it sell it to other consumers of power at a time when it might be more expensive? So in that 4 till 7 p.m. window in an evening, or 9 to 11 in the morning. So it widens what the revenue potential is for someone with a battery, takes stress away and reduces volatility that's coming from the grid. So I think that batteries are really exciting when you think about where they're going to head.
Do we have a sense across the panel of the proportion of renewable energy generation that we can achieve by 2030? What's the split between renewable and our traditional methods?
Well, let's pick up a couple of things. There's stuff that has been said and committed to, and then there's the cold reality of what's going to turn up. So should we let's pick up those two. So look, I was working at National Grid a few years ago. At COP26, Boris Johnson stood up and said, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, we're going to be net zero by 2030, right? So this isn't a Conservative versus Labour debate. This is the target was set cross-party, right? So net zero is a thing for everyone, not the weaponization that we see today. But also the cold reality is, what does that look like? Net zero is not absolute zero, okay? It doesn't mean you're only running. So what we've seen since that evolution is actually a cold reality, which is use renewables when you've got renewables, still have a little bit of gas as backup to meet that short-term need. The winter, the Dunkelflaute is those low wind, low solar periods, but effectively over-generate when there's an abundance and export it across interconnectors. So we are net zero. Are we absolute zero? No, it'll probably be about 95% in cold reality. As somebody who's been kicking around this space for a while, but don't see that as a failure, because we've gone. I mean, look, if your earlier comment of central generated coal, central generated power, that was coal. The Industrial Revolution was powered on coal. We don't have any coal in the system now. Look how far we've achieved. Look how far renewables has gone. If you look at the grid queue, and you can see all of those wind farms and solar plants that are in the grid queue, there is enough in the grid queue to get us comfortably to about 2037 right now, and be on target towards net zero as an energy system. So this isn't a case of there's not enough renewables. It is just stacking the old thermal plant coming off the bars, or at least being mothballed in case you need it, and new renewables coming on, and the build out of the grid to connect it all up. So this is, again, whole systems, but we will get to a point where we're probably 90-95% run on renewables.
So let's say then that a business out there listening to this does nothing about their own generation or storage of electricity and relies on the grid over the next 10 years. What's the single biggest risk that they're taking? Because ultimately what you're saying is that somebody else will take care of it. It's all in train. Don't worry about it. Is that right? Is that the message I'm getting?
It doesn't address the price volatility issues that we have at the moment. And when we talk about achieving clean power by 2030, it will be longer. I mean, it's a huge undertaking that we're looking at. So at the moment, as a business, your electricity is mostly priced through the price of gas and whatever's happening in the international market with gas and with LNG, which is liquefied gas coming from the States. So the volatility won't go away in the short term. It's going to be there, and it's geopolitical, and it's governed by what's the weather in Japan, what's the weather in China, everything. There's so many things that go into your energy price, because we're still intrinsically linked to fossil fuels. That will decline in time, but it will take time to get there.
Going to go to the questions, because there's somebody called Sarah Sloman. Whatever. Yeah, well, exactly. My thoughts exactly. One of the places I visited once that seemed to have an impossible task was a glass factory with a huge furnace. Now, they were adamant that there was no electrify. Don't know if she speaks English at all, but I suspect what she's saying is that electricity is not really their option for huge energy requirements and furnaces. Is that right? And what do they do on sites where there's huge energy demand? Should they just be relying on the grid, or should it be, as you say, Graeme, the mix, that bit of renewable locally, storage, some national grid, and then you can balance the needs? What do you think, Charlie?
So something like an energy intensive industry is really interesting. And it's back to this point on moving energy away from a conversation that's just about commodity and about pound per megawatt hour. Their main focus as a business is keep the lights on, keep the furnace running. If the furnace stops running, the business falls down. The second one is the cost is really high. Energy is probably their largest cost in something like a glass factory there. So again, behind the scenes, can you match that to the most prevalent renewable sources, the most prevalent energy sources? So whether that is wind blowing overnight, whether that's a battery in the background, whether it's an anaerobic digestion plant that is producing all day, if you can match that generation, and ideally locally to avoid certain charges, to the shape of the consumption, that's going to lead to a lower cost. So if you're a glass factory, and we talk to lots of energy intensive industries, their main focus is cost and affordability. It is less about green and carbon. So what we want to do, and I think what the industry has to move to, is how do you solve that value proposition for the customer, and not just here's a pound per megawatt hour price.
I'd say something like a glass factory will have a pretty constant base load. It's going to be pretty firm. You're going to know what it is. So if there's space to put self-generation on that site, you can size it, and you know that 100% of what you're generating will go into that use. And that's a simple offset. It can be connected behind the bus bar with no need to export whatsoever. It takes away your grid issue, and it also softens your import. So very site specific.
It is very site specific. John, one of the things that I'm most excited about is private wire. So if you look, there is a grid queue of generators trying to get on the bars, right? So if you look in your local planning permissions and then you look on the distribution register, you can see the queue of generators looking to connect to the grid. You can also see the list of people looking to connect to the grid for demand. So one of the things to do, which is really, really smart, is to, if you're an energy intensive, go and find the nearest generator that's in a grid queue. And you can explore private wire from there. So it's a bit like putting solar on the roof, but if you didn't have a big enough roof, there might be acres of solar waiting for a grid connection. You can bypass the grid. Okay. So we need to think cleverly and not as binary, which is, this is my site, this is my problem. This is our problem. And how do we solve it? It's a collaboration question. And, the world was not designed, the energy system was not designed this way. But effectively, it's no different to a housing estate, right? A developer builds a housing estate, builds the roads. Oh, and guess what? At times, the council then adopts it and looks after it. So why don't we are in places connecting relatively, within a mile or so, a couple of miles, a separate generator from a separate demand and private wire. And that's a great one, because particularly if you have a smart supplier like Charlie's business, is they can actually help you manage the self-generation first and then the bought-in power second, and that volatility and that predictability. So I think it's important that we think a little bit more cleverly than just the binary, I need power, how do I do it? The one thing I'm going to lob in here is, if you are a really heavy heat demand, I'm going to say the word here, I know this is EV week, but hydrogen is a really interesting one. Hydrogen for heat. Okay. Hydrogen is not a yes, no. It's a right fuel, right application, right time. So it's going to be, hydrogen is niche, right? It could be quite sizable niche, but it is niche. Actually, those heat intensives, hydrogen might actually be maybe one of the better answers. But then that's you've seen one company, you've seen one company. It's not you've seen one company, you've seen them all. It's on a like-by-like basis.
We've got a great question from Saddam Kiwanuka. Now, Kiwanuka, Michael is the only Kiwanuka I know, pop star, and I don't know if you're related. But anyway, to what extent is the market offering battery as a service models for heavy duty fleets? For example, could a bus depot hire fully charged batteries each day rather than owning the batteries and chargers? That's different thinking. Not aware that it's possible. Well, it's possible, but it's not done commercially. Anybody know any different? John, Graeme, Charlie?
I've seen it done on festival sites where there's an operator, Vital EV, and they put a charging station in. They offer batteries in a Bowser, effectively, that rocks up into the car park and charges the cars. So it is something that is out there as a product.
From Felton, I think it's the Charge Cube, and it's a clever piece of kit. Uses Tesla batteries, so it takes them out of recycled Teslas, puts them into containers, and you can have them as big as you like. It's very clever, but it's very, very fledgling startup. Anybody else?
The other problem here is just one of economics, right? So as Charlie mentioned before, and I think John mentioned as well, a lot of the value of the battery is not just price arbitrage, charge it up cheap, right? Take the power out when it's expensive. A lot of the value stack of a battery is those flexibility grid services, right? Voltage control, frequency response, those grid services. They are an important stack in the value stack of all those things you need to make batteries work. For that to work, the battery needs to be hardwired to the grid, right? So there's part of the problem is not because it can't be done, is just the economics are against you. However, evolving that on, coming back to the sort of, do I have to pay for a battery? Not necessarily. Right, there are a number of businesses out there that are offering, deploying batteries to a site where you have the grid connection, they have the battery, and they're effectively renting your grid capacity, right? I've even seen businesses taking old distribution warehouses where they were an industrial site with a big grid connection, opening up the roller shutter doors, putting 2 shipping containers of batteries in and wiring them up. All of a sudden, powered land becomes a commodity. So if you're a fleet manager and you're looking to expand your business, most people kind of go, does it have road access? Is it? No. First question is, What's the grid capacity? So powered land then becomes a commodity. But this is about business model innovation, John. This is not just, I know we started with EVs and fleets, but this is actually about that whole systems thinking. This is about where the business is, how it consumes energy, what is the energy source, but also what are the economics and who can take the burden of those economics.
And talking of economics, Joe Rowley has said, you've mentioned that energy is now one of the top 4 costs in most businesses and that smart use of flexibility alone can unlock around 20% savings before you even add batteries or solar. From a financing point of view, how are the most advanced fleets structuring deals so that they can tap into those savings and new revenue streams like grid services without taking on huge upfront capex or technology risk themselves? And what are the commercial red flags that you would warn fleet managers to watch out for when they're offered no money down energy or charging solutions? Who wants to tackle that one?
So we're talking to multiple fleet providers, charging point management systems. I think they're at the beginning of that journey is what we see on a lot of those conversations. They know that they're electrifying fleet. They know that energy becomes a cost. They're right at that start of, okay, is it just a simple time of use tariff that does it? Where do I charge on the public network and what does that charge? But for most, and talking to a charge point management software company last week, they don't care. It's, does my fleet get charged on time and can they do the delivery? At this point in time, the cost of energy is the cost of energy, and I will pay it to make sure that the fleet runs smoothly. We're very quickly getting to that point of, well, let's do something smarter about that. And I think that's where the role of the technology layer comes in. Energy is the second subset to that. If you can control whether that's through smart charging, whether it's responding to flexibility, whether it's through having behind the meter solutions on a fleet depot, whether it is partnering with local businesses, so the likes of Royal Mail, BT, DPD have all got big fleets. Do they all need to have the same charging at the same depots, or can they actually be sharing that infrastructure, creating around it? I think so. We're starting to move into that point is what we see live.
And John, I was going to say, just I added into chat because one of the comments was, is there anybody doing this? Zenobē is a really obvious one to look out for. So Zenobē are a charging company, they're a finance company, they're a battery storage company, they're a flexibility company. So if you Google Zenobē, and I'm not picking Zenobē specifically, but it's a one you can Google and is readily available. There are others out there, if you're doing the full BBC neutral, not promoting one company, there are others out there doing this. But if you wanted to Google Zenobē and see what they're doing, see what they've done in the news. They've done bus fleets, they've done truck fleets and van fleets. They've also done just battery storage around renewables. And so they're a great one if you want to see the art of the possible, but there are other people out there doing that. I mean, we see it in other areas as well, John. I'm currently working on a data center right here in the US, and they're having to power their own stuff. They've not got the balance sheet to make a gas-fired power station, right? So it's a case of, how do you innovate? Who wants to own a power station? Somebody who owns power stations. So I think it's a case of if you're the fleet owner, you don't have to own all of the problem yourself. Work out what are the bits that you can own and want to own and take the risk on, and outsource the other risks to others. So if it's volatility in supply, talk to Charlie, right? If it's about self-generation, talk to John. If it's about somebody outsourcing the finances, there are other business models that are out there that can take that on.
Yeah,
agree with that.
How do you find good friends in this industry? There's a lot of people prepared to give you advice and tell you what they know. How do you know you can trust what you're being told? Are we at the point where the charlatans, if you like, the cowboys, those who are looking to make a fast buck aren't here anymore? Or do you still have to tread carefully? John?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I would say look at track record and look at experience more than anything else, and look at previous projects and where those projects have been successful. There's nothing like track record at the end of the day, and that says a lot. But it's very difficult to say what else is going on in the industry. But we've moved it from a time where people were speculating over grid connections and selling them on to people to a more sensible time now, and it's hopefully looking a lot better.
I guess a final thought from me is that there's a need to, we spoke about the energy strategy, and there's a need to have that strategy. But I suspect that that has a long-term positive impact on asset value. If you've got a piece of land, if you've got a building where you have an energy strategy in place and you have made that shift to generation, storage, use, your asset value increases. Is that right?
Oh, yes and no. So it's a little careful. If you own the building and you own the grid and you own the generation in the back, yes, that's one option. But don't forget, many businesses just lease a building. You've got a challenge here where you have a full repairing lease. So when the lease is up, you have to turn everything back. Oh, that starts to erode that. So it's a little bit niche, John. It's not quite as binary. But linking that and your previous question, that's why you need good consultants. Having worked for both Jacobs and I now work for AECOM. Free advice is often a good pointer, but free advice gets paid for somewhere, either because of inexperience or whatever. Get people to back up any advice with facts and show demonstrable track record. But yeah, coming back to your point around added value, yes, but would be my question. You need to think a little bit more strategically about what you own and what you don't own, and the risk of unintended consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a comment from Saddam Kiwanuka. He can confirm that he's not related to Michael, but they are both Ugandan. And can I just say, National EV Week for the UK, reaching out to Ugandans, fabulous. We are all on a journey. Final thoughts. Let me go very quickly around my virtual table. Charlie, your final thoughts. We were talking about creating off-grid capacity, helping people, businesses to make good use of the assets that they have and need. What are your final thoughts to help people?
I think final thoughts is do it in steps, plug it into what you're doing. Agree with the comments earlier about it's a holistic energy strategy. So if that's consuming at a different time of day as step one, brilliant. If that is having your own generation assets to avoid consuming, the best power is the one that you don't consume, excellent. If that is all the way down to much more integrated, optimized pieces around batteries, flexibility, even better. But I think we're in a scale-up world, so we're very biased on action. I think taking those first steps and thinking, how do we do this better? That's kind of the main factor for me.
Talking action, man. John Fairlie, what about you?
I'd agree with the holistic energy approach. So look at everything in one hit. Look at what you're consuming. Look at what you can do to offset that consumption, whether it be through being a bit more clever with when you charge, when you don't charge, your own on-site generation, but also in that mind, think of your business growth strategy and future proofing as well. Because if you are going to spend money on new infrastructure, think ahead. Where do you want to end up being? Because once you've installed it, it can be a little bit more expensive if you need to expand it. It would be better to do it in one hit.
Yeah. And the Cooper man, what have you got for us to finish off?
Both of these fine gentlemen were exactly right. I'm agreeing violently with them. The one addition I would say is get good advice. Energy security is the security of your business. Energy is the barrier to what you do. It's one of your biggest costs. It's the thing that changes your economics. Own the problem, get good advice, think whole system, because arguably that advice might cost you money, but it's defensible when you want to borrow money. It will also avoid you a ton of cost and a ton of risk. I would say that get good advice is probably, and again, I work for a consulting business, but in many cases, we see that our cost is more than adequately recovered because of the savings and avoided risk that you've taken. So don't assume that just because you've got a switch in your house and every time you switch it on, the light comes on so you can do energy. Do not assume that the internet and armchair experts will give you all of the answers. These are complex systems of systems, and you need someone to make sure that you're not having unintended consequences. So it's all about good, backed up by good science and engineering and analysis, good advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you need good advice, Charlie, Graeme and John Fairlie, you are outstanding. UrbanChain, thank you for sponsoring today's session. This has been the National EV Week session on going off grid, doing things for you, energy security, bit of planning, find some good friends, do things well, do things better.